so far already. We've been blessed. We've been blessed. Indeed. Now, I did wonder when I realised that it was a Champions League final last night, and we have quite a number of Liverpool supporters in chapel, especially these youngsters down here, and I thought, well, maybe I better prepare a word on dealing with disappointment in advance, just in case. I mean, you know, for Spurs fans, it's not a disappointment, is it? Because they didn't expect to win, but for Liverpool fans, it would have been a great disappointment, but that didn't happen, so that's great. That's great. Did anybody notice, though, I saw some pictures which I think were taken from the game last night, of the goalkeeper, Liverpool's goalkeeper, after the game was finished. Now, can anyone tell me what was on his T-shirt? Can you tell me, Jacob? Or something? Pardon?
Christ equals love.
Yeah, it was something like that. I can't remember exactly, but it was... Yes, James, what are you going to...
It was a cross with an equal sign that said handle on it.
I'm as deaf as a post.
It had a cross with an equal sign that handle on it.
It had cross equals love, did it? Is that what it had? Yeah. Someone said that's what it had on it. The cross equals love. He's a Christian man, you see. He's the goalkeeper. Alisson, is it? Yes, Phew. Alison, I'm a Liverpool supporter and I don't know anything about them. I'm one of these Liverpool supporters who comes out when they win. So I was last supporting Liverpool in 2005 when we won the Champions League. And I was challenged. I thought, well, I just reminded me this morning, I thought I wouldn't, you know, if I treat church like I treat Liverpool, I wouldn't be much use, would I, when I just turned out to shout from the rooftops twice every 14 years. You know, if we treat God like people treat their football teams, we'd be far better examples of him, wouldn't we? You know, people are more than happy to wear shirts and to shout about the team that they love, and yet Jesus who died for us, and yet so often we keep quiet. That's aside. Jonah, chapter 2. Last time I spoke, I said to Evelyn I was speaking on Jonah. She said, you always speak on Jonah. She said, no, I thought I'd only ever done once spoken on Jonah here, unless it means that maybe I just go around, I don't know. But I haven't spoken on Jonah chapter 2 before. So we're in Jonah chapter 2. And next week we might be in Jonah chapter 3. You never just know. Jonah chapter 2, starting at verse 1, it's 10 verses long. From inside the fish, Jonah prayed to the Lord his God. He said, in my distress I called to the Lord, and he answered me. From the depths of the grave I called for help, and you listened to my cry. You hurled me into the deep, into the very heart of the seas, and the currents swirled about me. All your waves and breakers swept over me. I said, I have been banished from your sight, yet I will look again towards your holy temple. The engulfing waters threatened me, the deep surrounded me, seaweed was wrapped around my head. To the roots of the mountains I sank down. The earth beneath barred me in forever, but you brought my life up from the pit, O Lord my God. When my life was ebbing away, I remembered you, Lord, and my prayer rose to you, to your holy temple. Those who cling to worthless idols forfeit the grace that could be theirs, but I, with a song of thanksgiving, will sacrifice to you. What I have vowed, I will make good. Salvation comes from the Lord. And the Lord commanded the fish, and it vomited Jonah onto dry land. I've got 3 short points. I haven't got the joys of a PowerPoint display. I'm not that forward thinking. But the first one is God is in control. As we see through the first 2 chapters of Jonah, right through the book, we see how God is in control of all things. We see, don't we, in chapter 1, how God is in control of the sea, and he's in control of the fish that comes and swallows Jonah. But in our chapter tonight, in chapter 2, we find Jonah is inside that fish. He's inside the fish. And he got there because he was disobeying God, wasn't he? God had asked him to do a task for him. God had asked Jonah to go to the people of Nineveh to tell the people about the fact that their wickedness had come up before God. God could see the wrong things that they were doing. And God was going to judge them because of the wrong that they were doing. You see, Jonah thought he was in control. Jonah thought he was in control of his life, didn't he? And he thought he would go in the complete opposite direction. If you had a map on the screen of where Jonah was and where Jonah had been told to go, as opposed to where he actually went, you couldn't get much more opposite. He went in the complete opposite direction. Sometimes we can be a bit like that, can't we? We think that we're in control of our lives. Sometimes we think, I'm the one who's in control, and we quite like to be in control, don't we? The world tells us, don't we, that we only have to look out for ourselves, and as long as we're happy and we're not hurting anyone else, we're in control. But the Bible shows us clearly that we aren't in control, and that we can only be free indeed, by giving our lives over to God. You see, Jonah trying to be in control resulted in him being inside a fish. And if you spot the sequence of events, Jonah starts off on the land, and then the next thing he does is he decides to get on a boat. Well, I would suggest that being on a boat is significantly worse than being on the land. And then the next step is in the sea. Well, I would say that's far worse than being on the boat. And the next thing is in a fish. You see, going in the opposite way to God, ignoring God's command and doing the opposite, is a road that leads to progressively worse things. You see, the second little heading I've written down is that our actions have consequences. We see here, don't we, for Jonah, that not following God, that actually has consequences for Jonah. It's the same today, isn't it? People thinking they can do what they want. Verse 8 tells us, doesn't it? Those who cling to worthless idols forfeit the grace that could be theirs. We're all very good, aren't we, at putting our trust in things that are so temporary. Anything that takes the place of God in our lives is something that shouldn't be there. It's a worthless idol that we cling to. And clinging to worthless idols, as the verse tells us, means that we forfeit the grace that could be ours. The Bible tells us very clearly that it's important that we put God as the first place in our life. If we stick close to Jesus and keep him as number one, we'll be heading in the right direction. The Bible tells us, doesn't it, that the actions of the Ninevites, being a wicked people, that was going to have consequences. That reminds us for the world that we live in, there are consequences for living a wrong life. God is the same, isn't he? The same yesterday, today, and forever. And a God who a God who judges sin is the same today as it was in the days of Jonah. See, our sin in our lives separates us from God. It keeps people apart from him. And Jonah was told to go and tell them. And that's also our job as Christian people, isn't it? As Christian people, it's our job to be Jesus' examples here on earth. We're ambassadors to a world which we don't belong to. We're ambassadors to the world in which we live in, but we are not really part of. And in verse 7, we see there with Jonah, and this can be the same for our lives too. When my life was ebbing away, I remembered you, Lord, and my prayer rose to your holy temple. It says there, when my life was ebbing away. Why do we so often leave it till the last moment before we turn back to God? Often in our lives, don't we? We try every other which way. I think it's part of our human nature to do that. We like to think that we can manage on our own. Michael, who works with me 3 or 4 days a week, he says one of the surest ways of making sure that I get on and do a job that I'm struggling with is by offering to give me help. He says if he sees I'm struggling with something, he says, oh, do you want a hand with that? He says, you can be sure that I'll put in the effort to get it done on my own. He says, that's the sort of person that I am. And he's probably right in some ways. I like to be able to do things on my own. I like to be able to complete the task in front of me. Well, that can often lead to getting into a position that's really difficult. And it's the same with our lives, isn't it? Why is God so often used as a last resort in our lives? Only when things are really tough. If we use God like that, it's not much of a relationship, is it? It's a very up and down relationship where we fall away and then jump back. Much better to stay close all the time. All the time. It's a bit like, you could say life is a little bit like rock climbing, which Jen was telling us she's been rock climbing some years ago. When you're rock climbing, you have a rope, don't you? A safety rope, which you stay fastened to it all the time. Why would you ever take your safety buckle off that rope? And that's what it's like with Jesus. How often do we think, well, we can manage this bit on our own, so we'll just take the clip off. We'll just go for a little wander out here. Let's stick close to God. Then we won't make the mistakes that Jonah made. But thankfully, the last point we see is God's compassion. God's compassion, even though Jonah had made a mess. Even though Jonah had made a mess of things and gone the opposite direction to God, God was only willing to rescue him and to put him back on track. We might not always like the way that happens. He didn't get a nice ride on the top of the fish, did he? He had to go through some difficult times. But God put him back on track. You see, we come to a God who is a compassionate God, a God who is a loving God, a God who loves us, whatever we've done and wherever we've been. All we need to do is to realise our need of him, our need of Jesus, to confess that we've done wrong, that we've messed up. And he's more than willing to come back alongside and to help us through, just as he did with Jonah. Amen. And now in closing, as we close, we're going to sing What a Beautiful Name. What a beautiful name it is, the name of Jesus.